Perfect. I'm Lexi Wilson. I'm a reporter with WCNC-Charlotte, and I will pass this off.
Hey guys, my name is Jessica Maria. I'm a housing justice organizer with Action North Carolina.
Cool.
Hi everybody, my name is Sturgill. I'm an attorney. I represent tenants that are being evicted from their homes. I've been doing that for about 10 years or so. I've worked with Legal Aid in North Carolina.
Great. And this session is all about renters' rights and kind of some of the legislation that is currently in place. And I've been covering housing, specifically affordable housing and what renters deal with for a little bit over a year, and it's just a conversation that never goes away. And it's really impacting everybody, people who are working and going to a job every day, and of course those who are homeless as well. But I do want to start off and ask Jessica, just kind of, obviously you're out in the community, and I want to learn a little bit more about what's happening on the ground.
Absolutely. So something that I did want to touch on is that tenants are not the enemy, tenants are not the problem. And a lot of the narratives that we hear that tenants are bad or they don't take care of the property or they're causing crime. Tenants are not the problem. The problem is what we allow as a community to happen. The problem is the resources that are not, there's an imbalance, there is injustice. If people don't have the resources, crime will follow. If people don't have homes, crime will follow. If we get folks that are in the streets, if we get them housed, they'll be safe. If we regulate the rent increases, people will not get displaced from their homes. They will be safe. If we develop housing that people can afford to buy, people will be safe. And so I just want to reiterate that tenants are not the problem. The problem is what we allow. And so what I see on the ground is people dealing with rent increases, $200, $300. Wages are not going up. I see folks that are renting from corporate landlords that have thousands of homes and apartment units that they own. And their business structure is raising the rents and not upgrading or upkeeping to the same level. So I see displacement all the time. I see predatory practices. I see people getting taken advantage of. I see people deciding to live in squalor because I'd rather live in squalor and have a home than complain and get evicted due to retaliation. And that's real. That's real in HUD properties, that's real in corporate landlord properties, that's real across the board. Because it happens. So that's what I see.
And you mentioned displacement. Can you kind of speak to me a little bit about what these families say to you when they are being displaced and where exactly do they go?
So something that the other panelists had talked about is that there are a lot of households that have more than one family living in the household in order to be able to afford the rising rents. Something about, what is it called? Demand and, what is it? What's the thing? Supply and demand, that thing. People need housing. So even though the prices go up, people are gonna figure out a way to pay the rent so that they're not on the street, right? And so if that means living in a house with 3 other families, that's what's gonna happen. And so I hear that. I hear that, and I hear people saying, I've made requests for repairs multiple times, I've waited months, I've had to come out of pocket to pay these repairs. And people just take it because that's the way things are. Can't do anything about it. So that's what people are experiencing. I've heard tenants that rent from corporate landlords like Progress, Invitation Homes, Tricon, American Homes for Rent, and they say, well, a lot of these communities are in HOAs, and a tenant says, I wasn't provided the bylaws. I don't know what the rules of the community are. So I'm getting these fines from my landlord, and I wasn't even provided the bylaws. I didn't know that the trash cans had to be at the back of the house and not on the side. That's crazy to me. And that's a problem. That's a problem.
And you see it from the side of eviction.
Mhm.
Talk to me a little bit about what you see when you are in court and the families that you hear from.
Yeah, so legal aid, we kind of see the symptoms of Charlotte's affordable housing problem because we deal with the families that are kind of at the last step in the process that have had eviction court papers filed against them and they're being evicted from their homes through the court system. And, during the pandemic, which, everybody remembers in the not so distant past, there was an eviction moratorium in place for a while that did kind of curb the number of evictions that were happening, but that's gone now. Most of the federal rental assistance that was available during that time period is gone now. And so what we've seen over the last few months is basically a return to normal, pre-pandemic levels of eviction filings, which is about, in Mecklenburg County, about 30,000 a year. There's 3 eviction courtrooms in Mecklenburg County that operate 5 days a week. There's literally thousands of cases a month that go through the courthouses. So a return to normal is not a good thing. And even pre-pandemic, Mecklenburg County's eviction rate is like twice the national average. It's disproportionately, it has a disproportionate effect on certain communities, especially women of color, that have children are disproportionately affected by the evictions here. So we're back to normal pre-pandemic, but that's not a good thing. It just seems like that's not a good thing to go back to. Some of the stuff we see in eviction court, there are laws that protect tenants in North Carolina, like tenants have the right to repairs, they have the right not to be charged illegal fees and things of that sort, but a lot of tenants are unaware of their rights, so we do see a lot of illegal fees being charged by landlords, issues not being repaired. We do see retaliation, where if a tenant complains about repairs, that the landlord will file an eviction case against them. All that stuff is pretty common. When we can represent a tenant in court, we have about an 85% success rate, which is pretty good. That drops to below 50% if you don't have an attorney. And speaking of supply and demand, we've got like 12 attorneys. We closed about 1,700 cases last year, which is significant, but that's not 30,000, right? So I think there's a national statistic, like for every one legal aid attorney that's available, there's like 10,000 people that qualify or something like that. So there are laws that protect tenants out there, but the question is, like, are people aware of them, and are they able to advocate for themselves or find somebody to advocate for them?
And we've talked a little bit about this before, but about self-eviction.
Yeah.
Because people don't know the legal system or the rights they have. Can you kind of explain that as well?
Yeah, so the way the eviction process works in North Carolina, the only way a landlord can legally evict somebody, they have to file a lawsuit, and they have to have a trial in front of a magistrate, and there has to be a court order that says that the landlord's allowed to change the locks. And that process, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it takes some time. And there is an opportunity for the tenant to go to court and be heard by the judge and put on any kind of defense that they may have. A lot of tenants don't realize that, so it's something where, like, they get an eviction notice, they don't know how the process works or how the law works, so they think, for example, that if they're not out by the day the landlord told them to be, that the landlord can put all their stuff out on the curb the next day. And so they do something we call self-evicting, which is like they're unfamiliar or they're scared of the process, and so they will leave even if they have something to complain about or some kind of defense that might be available, because they don't understand how it works. And another issue, speaking of self-evictions in the undocumented immigrant community in Charlotte, like, we're finding a lot of that population is afraid to have any contact with the court whatsoever, and so that's another population that we see self-evicting a lot.
Right. And obviously we're talking a lot about solutions today. Do you guys have any solutions, or was there anything that you've heard even throughout today that you think could be beneficial to renters?
I'll take it. Well, I pray to God that we come together and we really work as a one unit. There were a lot of organizations that were present today that are still here. There were a lot of leaders that are present, and behind every leader there's people. And every organization is working in their respective lane, naturally. However, if we want real solutions, we have to come together. We have to create our vision and our plan and fight for it. The law is limiting if we allow it to be. It's unlawful It's against the law for us to push for rent control. It's illegal. And that's what we need. We need rent control. We need
Yes.
regulation on how much the rent goes up.
Yes.
There is no amount of money that if I'm renting and I'm not in a lease, my lease is up, the landlord can go up 100% on my rent. And there is no law that protects me as a consumer. The people that have the power are the corporations. The corporations have the power. They have the unlimited supply of money. They're buying homes by the thousands. Corporate landlords own single-family homes, more than 40,000 in the state of North Carolina. More than 25,000 in Charlotte and surrounding. These are homes in starter communities, homes that I could have bought with my husband as my first home, but I didn't. I'm in Gastonia now, and I work in Charlotte, and I'm not the only one in this situation. It's a problem. Isaac, I know that there's a probability if a tenant has court and they're represented. What's the percentage you said that for them to win that case?
Yeah, so for the tenants that have attorneys, I mean, your chance of avoiding an eviction goes way up. So it goes up from like below 50% to about 85%.
Okay, let me get the mic one more time.
Yeah.
We need right to counsel. We need for tenants to go to court and to automatically have representation. Right? Right now, legal aid does a lot of that work, but they don't have capacity or the funding or the manpower to handle every single case that's needed. I speak to tenants all the time, and sometimes tenants don't meet the income qualifications to be represented by legal aid or other qualifications. So we need more of that work to be done. We need, like I said, regulations. It's not a bad thing to regulate. It is not a bad thing to regulate. We need that. We need right to counsel. We need cooperative housing. We need tiny homes. We need in-law suites in the back of our houses. We need, what is it called? 3D printing houses. We need all of that. But we need to come together and push for it. And this legislation that's being introduced that's attacks tenants and low-income people, we need to be on that and say, no, we don't accept that. But until we come together and we really fight it, it's gonna keep happening.
Speaking of legislation, I don't know who wants to take this, but what is some of the legislation right now when it comes to renters?
Yeah, so I can talk some about some recent bills. I did want to say really quickly that I do think, obviously I'm biased, but right to counsel for tenants is super important. You know, on the positive note, there has been some movement across the state to increase tenant representation, and I'd be amiss if I didn't, say Mecklenburg County, for example, has been funding a project at Legal Aid for the last several years to basically quadruple the number of attorneys that we have. We went from an office of about 5 to about 20, and so we went from doing like 300 cases a year to like 15 to 1,700, which is significant improvements. But again, 1,700 out of 30,000 is not a big percentage, right? So it's not that some people are trying to increase that. It looks different across the state. Guilford County, for example, in Greensboro is funding an eviction project there, eviction diversion. The same thing in Winston-Salem. Durham has a healthy program that's funded mostly by the city. So that is something that's been changing over the last few years, is like where the communities are becoming more and more concerned about these problems, and they're realizing the value of representation for tenants, and there have been some local governments pitching in to try to help bridge that gap, but there's still a huge gap as far as the amount of people that need the assistance. I think the first city to do right to counsel was New York City in New York, and they said it's for everybody, and they rolled it out by zip code. And there's been some bumps in the road, but I think that was the first city to kind of say, just like if you're being charged with a crime, if you're being evicted, the consequences of being evicted are really severe too. So we're going to give you the right to an attorney. With the state of the laws in North Carolina, I just wanted to pick a couple things where Jessica was talking about how it's illegal to pass rent control legislation. That's true in North Carolina. That's not a new thing. There's been a law on the books since I think 1980.
80s,
that says that it's a state law that says that local governments, like local counties and cities, are not allowed to pass rent control ordinances. So even if like the city of Charlotte or Mecklenburg County wanted to say, hey, we're passing this ordinance that says that landlords can't raise the rent more than 3% a year, or something like that, which a lot of different cities and even some states across the nation have legislation like that, because of that state law that we can't. So just talking from that perspective, as far as like rent control legislation, that would have to be a change that would be done at the state level, because that state law would have to be stricken down before any kind of local government could get involved. And the last couple of bills that come through the General Assembly in North Carolina have not been good for tenants. Kind of semi-recently, back in 2015, the legislature changed the rules and increased the types of illegal fee, or the types of fees that landlords can charge. So as to where before certain types of fees were illegal, they became legal when that law was changed. There was something that was in the news recently, you all may have heard of the hotel bill. So the status of the law in North Carolina for a long time is that if you live in a hotel and that's your primary residence, and you're considered a tenant under the law just like any other tenant. And the most important thing about that is that if you're a tenant, you can't be evicted other than through the court process. But if you're not considered a tenant, like if you're just considered a guest but you don't have tenants' rights, the hotel doesn't have to go through that court process. They can change your key card without a court order, or they can throw your stuff out, or do whatever they want to do. And so during the pandemic, the number of self-help evictions, where like illegal evictions in hotels, was skyrocketing. The Attorney General's office got involved, legal aid got involved, crisis got involved. There's a bunch of the county, the city was all fighting that, and that had a chilling effect on those illegal hotel evictions. But this bill that was recently passed in the General Assembly essentially is a bill. It's in direct response to everything I just talked about that happened during the pandemic with the hotels. It was the statewide hotel association lobbied for this bill. But essentially, the law now says if you've been in a hotel less than 90 days, that you don't have any tenant rights. Like, you're not considered a tenant, you're considered a guest, and that means if the hotel wants to get rid of you, if you've been there for less than 90 days, they don't have to go through the court process to do that. Excuse me. So that's not a great change. There's a bill right now that's being kicked around, and I think there's some negotiation going on that does a few different things. It again increases the types of fees landlords can charge against tenants. It provides for penalties against like a tenant who's claiming that they need an emotional support animal. It gives like landlords a way to sue them if they think that they're lying about it. And then there's some other bits and pieces there. But I think in general the trend is that we see throughout the years is like usually when some type of legislation passes, it's not good for tenants. It's usually better for the landlords, and that's been kind of the pattern for at least the last 10 years that I've been practicing.
We're a small group, so I do want to ask if there's any questions so far right now.
I have a bunch of questions.
Of course.
I don't think
You don't need that?
No. So you're saying that there is no current legislation that could benefit tenants?
There's some pieces of stuff, and there has been attempts to pass laws that are helpful for tenants. One of the big things that a lot of people are concerned about are eviction records, because after you have an eviction case filed against you, that goes, that's a public record, and it makes it really hard to get approved for another apartment. So there's been several failed attempts to pass legislation to create some type of expungement process for evictions, which does not exist right now. So right now in North Carolina, if you have an eviction case filed against you, there's no way to erase that record. Like, most landlords only look back 7 to 10 years, but if you looked hard enough, you could find records of someone that was evicted 30, 40 years ago, right? So there's no expunction process. There's been some attempts to do that. Those have fallen flat. There's a bill that's being kicked around right now that has a lot of good stuff for landlords. There's a couple pieces that may be good for tenants in there. Like there's one in there where, and it's still fluid, so this may not be the way it ends up. There's still like negotiations going on, but there's some talk about including something to where if you have an eviction case filed against you, but you win your case, or if your case is dismissed, that a credit reporting agency would not be allowed to report that as an eviction to a landlord, because it's the same thing as like being arrested and then being acquitted of the crime, right? So why consider the filing if the tenant ultimately prevailed? So there are small pieces of stuff. Predominantly, most of the stuff in the last 10 years has been for landlords and not really for tenants. There have been some pieces of things for tenants to try to help them out as well, but mostly those bills have like, died in the General Assembly for the most part.
Can I mention on that one too?
Do you want?
I feel like y'all can hear us, right?
Right, yeah. Do we need the mic? Maybe not.
I
Okay.
Eviction expungement. I wanted to talk about that because business as usual means if you are late on the rent after the 5th, and there is you're in an apartment complex. If you're the manager, you have a list, an Excel sheet of people that has not paid the rent, and you're gonna file on a certain date. Whether this person, and I've heard people say, I've made a payment arrangement. I've talked to my property manager, made payment arrangements, and they still filed on me.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we need it. There's no landlord accountability. People express their grievances, and they are not heard. So we need to level the field. It's not level, it's unjust. Mm-hmm. And eviction expungement is a way. But we really need to focus on, as a community, again, on the structural issues, on the legislation that is causing all of the harm. Because if we don't, we're putting Band-Aids on all of the programs are Band-Aids if we're not fixing the laws that are causing the issues, point blank. And so something else that we can do, and we talked a bit about in the other panels, is we need to invest in housing that's owned by the people, cooperative housing, the land trusts, because right now housing is a commodity. If you have money, then you can afford a safe place to live. If you don't have money, you're on the streets in the woods, literally. Not too long ago, the city was taken over by what we call the tent city. We don't see them anymore, but they are still there. They're in the woods. They were pushed out of our sight. We can't let that happen. We can't let people be pushed into the woods because we don't want to deal with the trash, the rats. Yes, those are issues. So why don't we do housing first, put people in homes. It costs less to put people in homes than it costs for ambulances, for calling out the police, for all of these things. It's proven. There are studies on it. And so we need to invest in decommodified housing. Another term for it is social housing. And so that's what we need to push for. We need to level the playing field because right now there are no regulations. We can't push rent control because that's been on the books since the 80s, right? And most of the folks that are in office in our General Assembly across the board are landlords. Why would they push legislation that will benefit tenants? And I'm sorry, but we can't wait for landlords to do the right thing. There are good landlords. I know some. That's not the point. The point is we see all the issues. And if the laws aren't working right now, then we need to push for change.
Go ahead.
And I agree with Jessica. We need to change the system more than the programs. And I have a couple of questions. The first one is, have you seen, guys, any place in the country which changing the system are in place besides New York maybe, in order to protect the tenants?
Yeah, and I'm going to have trouble naming them off the top of my head, but the right to counsel movement, for example, which was the example I gave in New York, is something that's been building traction for years now. And there's a national organization that champions that called a National Right to Counsel is the name of that organization. And tenant representation is pretty big on that list. New York is not the only one that has right to counsel legislation, and we've seen more cities and some states even getting on that bandwagon over the last few years and providing more and more funding because they realize like putting money into stopping evictions on the front end saves you money off the back end when you don't have people crowding emergency rooms and jails and homeless services and all that other kind of stuff as well. So that's one example. I mean, and that's a movement that's growing traction, and there's more and more cities like every year that sign onto some type of legislation like that.
Austria, Vienna, has the best social housing, public housing. They're a good model for us to follow. Google it, YouTube it, social housing Vienna. And these, imagine a high-end hotel. You have pools, you have childcare, you have medical care, all in the same area. You can walk to these things. You can leave your home, go to the gym, you can drop your kids off at daycare, go to work. Everything we envision of like all the resources that we need in one place, like that's what they have there. And I think we can have it here too. I think we can have houses that are beautiful, homes that are beautiful, decent. We're people, we're all people. Whether you're on the street and you have money, or sometimes we forget that. Mental health is a real thing. I know people that are professionals that deal with mental health. I was dealing with mental health issues during the pandemic. I lost myself for a bit. The problem is some people have support, some people don't. And if we are not going to be that support for that person, that, you know, what if we were in that position? Substance abuse is a thing. It's not a crime. Depending on who you are, right? It's a crime, right? Historically. Depending on what color your skin is, it has been a crime historically. But substance abuse it's something that you need treatment for, something that you need help with. So again, if we don't put the resources, if we don't invest in public housing, we can't expect for, you know, Tent City to be gone. We can't expect for people to stop being displaced. Like Gregory said in the other panel, if you weren't there, he's seen this 40 years ago. Some of us seen it since the 80s. How long was the 80s? More than 40 years? 20? 10? We have to stop having these conversations. People get tired of having conversations if we don't actually push for something.
Do you have another
Another
question?
one, I'm going to go back to programs because I'm concerned if, from your point of view, the language barrier we have here for tenants, especially immigrants, you know, they don't speak well the language, and sometimes access to programs or the rights that they have are really, you know, really legal, complicated language. So from your point of view, do you think there's a problem with the language barriers to access to programs or to, you know, to the rights of the tenants?
Yeah, I guess I can start on that. One good development over the last several years is that the court system is actually pretty friendly as far as people that speak different languages, and it didn't always used to be that way. When I first started 10 years ago, I remember going into eviction court, and if somebody didn't speak English, the judge was basically like, do your best, and the trial just goes on, and they have no idea what's happening. But that's changed. I think that was kind of from the state court level coming down, but now in eviction court, for example, if you don't speak English as your primary language, you can let the judge know, and they will stop the proceeding. They'll put it off for another day, and then the court will, you know, pay for an interpreter to come for free and interpret for that person during the proceeding. So there has been some progress, like with that. For example, as far as other resources, you know, it kind of depends on, you know, the language and everything like that. Legal Aid tries really hard to make a lot of our materials at least also available in Spanish, and to have people like Spanish-speaking staff and things of that sort. And there's other nonprofits too that are able to also step in and help, you know, people that speak Spanish. Languages other than Spanish, it gets a little bit harder in that situation, and the resources may be less at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a work in progress. But I am encouraged to see how much progress the court system's made on that, because it just seemed really unfair back in the day for someone to be evicted and not even know what was going on the entire time. Yeah.
I would say, I'm gonna say something. The system isn't working for people that speak English. It's not it's especially not gonna work or be friendly it's not friendly in general, right? It's really hard for people to get the resources that they need to know their rights. I mean, we see it all the time. People self-evict. They get a letter and they get scared and they leave.
Just for a second too, I mean, I want y'all to understand the legal process. So there are people that self-evict or that are illegally evicted, but when the landlord goes through the legal process, it's stacked against the tenants too. Like there is a process for it, but the way that it works is after the landlord files The lawsuit, they schedule the trial at the time the landlord files, and it's usually 7 days from when they file, not when the tenant was served. So sometimes it's common, not sometimes, most of the time, tenants will get their court papers with their court date like 3 or 4 days before their trial, right? So they don't really have much time to find an attorney. They don't have time in many cases to get time off of work. And if you ever go into an eviction courtroom and you look how they set the dockets, they will put 100 cases per 1 hour docket, which sounds impossible. But the reason why they do that is because they know 90 to 95% of the tenants are not going to be able to show up for court. So most of the evictions that happen are through what we call like default judgments, where the landlord shows up, the tenant does not show up. They essentially just hand paperwork up to the judge, say this is the lease, this is the judgment, that they're not here, and then the court will grant the eviction order there. So the vast majority of people that get eviction judgments against them aren't able to show up for court and are not in court. There is an appeal process, so if you miss your court date and you lose, if you know about it and if you can pay for it, you can pay for an appeal and you can get a new trial in front of a different judge. But that's it's a small percentage of the cases that are appealed, again, because the people that aren't able to show up for court are not aware that there's an appeal process either. So it's just kind of like that's the end of it for them. Yeah.
Money is a major issue. If people can't afford to pay the rent, they can't afford to get time off work. So you talked about people that get 3-day notices.
Yeah.
Let's talk about people who didn't get, they didn't receive it. They didn't see it, they didn't receive it, and then someone's knocking on their door saying you're gonna get, like at some point, right, the sheriff comes and locks you out.
Yeah, and I think we have a question over here, but one other point on that too. To serve, for the landlord to serve the tenant with the eviction papers to start the court process, they don't even have to get what we call personal service. Like nobody has to hand it to the tenant doesn't have to sign for it. They can serve it just by going over there and taping a copy to the door, basically, and that's considered valid, service. So those trials happen really fast.
Right. Go ahead, you had a question?
Are there any requirements for telling the tenant what their options are when they're served? Because if they get something that says, okay, these are your options, they know what they can do. They know they can get counsel, they know their rights at the time they're being served.
We've worked on that at Legal Aid, and what we were able to do is to get the local clerk of court. Her name is Alyssa Chingary. She's been there for several years, but she agreed that when tenants in Mecklenburg County are served with court papers, that there's an information sheet. We call it the green sheet, and they're still getting sent out today. That basically has information, like some basic information on tenants' rights, and then there's contact information for legal aid, for example. So when you get served, you are served with that information sheet, and that has resulted in like an uptick of calls that we get for help. But a lot of times it's hard, you can't really give somebody specific legal advice unless you sit down and talk to them and know exactly what's going on in their situation. So we can't really just give like blanket advice that applies to everybody. We can give some general information that's helpful, but to actually get legal representation and advice that's specific to your situation, you'd have to meet with an attorney. Yeah.
Go ahead, you have a question?
I know this section is for renters' rights, but can I ask you a question as the owner's rights by any chance?
Any homeowner rights you guys know about?
In reference to tenants.
Oh, like the landlord that's on the other side.
Landlord versus tenants. Yes.
Yeah, I mean basically the landlords. I mean
Can
they.
I ask the questions?
Oh yeah. Sorry, you had a specific question. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
As a landlord,
Mhm.
we have several properties in Charlotte, and I've been here in Charlotte for 30 years. And most of our properties are now in black and white. And in the pandemic area, in pandemic, we lost 70% of the tenants didn't pay not even 1 penny for 2.5 years. 2.5 years, 70%. There's 24 houses who did not get paid. Okay? So we lost a lot of money. Finally, after 2.5 years, we had to ask them to leave. And they got a lot of money from the government, rental assistance, and the churches and everything. And when I go to the house, they have beautiful TVs, luxury sofas and everything. But they did not pay any rent for 2.5 years. And Spanish, we rented a house of recently, Spanish people. They didn't pay 3 months rent, plus they damaged the house for $10,000 right now. I'm fixing it. The question is, the young lady says, there should be rental control. Okay. Then who's going to pay my damages, my loss? How am I going to bring that money back? Second question is when I go to court, practically I had to walk every day to Mecklenburg County after the pandemic. I had to walk through practically every day to evict them. 24 hours. You know, it's $256 to justify this appeal. Then I had to time, my time, and so forth. Where is my rights? My wife is very, very nice to the parents. She not evict anybody. She goes, oh, it's okay, they got children, they got this, that. But she won't evict anybody. She gives time, she gives time. They take advantage of us. They don't pay 3-4 months. And then they leave. And where am I going to recoup all that money? So, I agree with you guys what you're saying, perfect. It sounds really good. But what about our problems? What are what tenants are doing to us?
Guys have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously every individual situation is a little bit different with that. I will say that we've heard a lot of frustration, and I understand it, especially during the pandemic, because there was like an eviction moratorium that took effect for a while. And so the eviction filings, and that was, I guess, the idea behind that from the federal government was to try to cut down the number of evictions because they were worried about the spread of COVID. So we were in this kind of strange new territory that we've never been in during the pandemic, where a lot of the eviction processes were stopped, and there were tenants that were out of work or whatever, and they were racking up large bills, and the landlords cannot evict them. That moratorium is gone now. There's a lot of rental assistance paid out that I think benefited both tenants and landlords, and so we're kind of back to the pre-pandemic days. I mean, the rights that the landlords do have is that the tenant is required to follow the lease. There is a legal process where if the tenant breaks a rule in the lease or commits a crime or any other number of rules, that the landlord does have the legal right to evict them through that court process, which starts in small claims court. If the tenant doesn't file an appeal, that process usually, in my experience, takes between like 5 to 8 weeks or something like that. And then, they can also ask for a judgment against the tenant to recoup whatever money that they've lost. So I mean, there are rules and laws that protect both landlords and tenants and govern both of them and say this is what it's legal for tenants to do, this is what it's legal for landlords to do. They both have obligations, they both have responsibilities as well. I'm not aware of like a free attorney service for landlords. In my experience though, when they get to court, most of them are represented, not all of them, and they are paying for that. But there is a power dynamic there too, where I think the UNCC did a study. This is back in like 2016, but they were surveying our local eviction courts and saw on average something like 90% of the landlords had a lawyer and less than 10% of the tenants had one. So like when you actually get to that point, you're in court and fighting it out, it's much less likely that the tenant's going to have legal representation and be getting like advice and stuff like that.
Great. We talked a little bit about rights counsel. What about more tenant unions as a solution to help renters?
We need tenant unions.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
I've worked on various campaigns in apartment complexes, mobile home parks, hotels, and even single-family homes now with the corporate landlords. Like Isaac mentioned, there's a power dynamic, and although there are always we're human, there are quote bad tenants and there are good tenants. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the power imbalance. Overall, tenants get abused. Overall, tenants get evicted, don't have options. And if we don't have, tenant unions will level the playing field a little bit. Imagine if apartment complex has a tenant union and they can have oversight of what's going on. They're in communication with each other. They know, oh, this happened, the office said this to me. Oh, well, they said this to me. Oh, well, this is the law because we have Isaac that can guide us on some things, right? That's power. That's, oh, they sent me a letter saying I have to leave. Oh, well, another neighbor knows their rights, so they can share it with them. Imagine that tenant union can negotiate directly with their landlord on the rental increases. That's a different type of power, and that's outside of the law. We're making an agreement, we're doing a contract, right? I'm agreeing to pay the rent by the 1st, no later than the 5th. I don't agree to 100% rent increase, but I can do a 3%. Let's negotiate, let's meet somewhere in the middle. That's what tenant unions can offer people. If people come together, they can have support. It's easier for someone to get targeted as an individual than as a group. It's easier for someone to get retaliated against if they're fighting alone than if they're fighting with a group. If all eyes are on the issue, then there's more power. And so tenant unions are really a great solution for right now, even though we don't have the greatest laws. We have laws that protect us, but there's still a lot that happens to tenants that a union can protect them.
There aren't many in North Carolina, are there?
People come together.
Yeah.
People come together. I think that when neighbors come together, they can call themselves a tenant union. If they're talking to their landlord jointly, Action NC, we support folks that want to come together and organize with their community. And right now we have a national tenant association for tenants that rent from corporate landlords. We talked about the single family homes, Progress, Invitation Homes, First Key, American Homes for Rent. These are companies that are buying entire neighborhoods, that are now developing entire neighborhoods, and that's a neighborhood that no one will be able to own because they only rent and they hold the properties. And so leveling the playing field, tenant unions can also solve that issue a little bit, even a little bit.
Definitely. I think my last question for you two, and then I will open it up to everybody else, but how can news organizations better tell the story of affordable housing?
Repeat your question.
Yeah, how can news organizations tell the story of affordable housing better? How can we do a better job of that? Whoever would like to go first.
Yeah, it's kind of, I've been representing tenants for 10 years in Mecklenburg County, which is a pretty long time, and I still find that a lot of the general population just doesn't understand like how big of an eviction problem that this county has compared nationally, and it's shocking. I think most people, you can see it with your own eyes if you go to the courthouse and go up to the second floor. There's 3 courtrooms that run 5 days a week, and they're all doing pretty much only eviction proceedings. And that's again hundreds of people a week, thousands of people a month that you'll see. So I think for starting place, and we talked about this a little bit. Just I would tell the news organization, like, go to eviction court and like talk to these people and ask them like, what are you going through, and sit down and watch. You can see the power dynamics playing out. You can sit there and you can watch a tenant who you can tell has some issue that they're trying to explain because they have a repair that hasn't been made, or they don't have any heat, it's the winter time, they're upset about that, but they don't know how to argue that to the judge. They don't have their evidence correct. Maybe they didn't bring all the pictures or the documents that they needed, and you can see what it's like for a tenant without an attorney to get beat up on by a landlord that has a lawyer, and you can kind of see that play out on a day-to-day basis. So I think that I would encourage people to go. It's free, it's public access, like anybody can walk into eviction court and take a look at what's going on. You can go there pretty much any day, Monday through Friday in the morning, and you'll see people being evicted. And again, with Mecklenburg County, I think more focus around that and actually seeing what it looks like is important. And I think that again, you know, Mecklenburg County, our eviction rate pre-pandemic and what we've gone back to now is like 2 times what the national average is.
I forgot what the question was after Isaac went.
How can news tell the story of
Yes.
affordable housing better?
Yes. I was thinking that more investigative reporting will help because a lot of people, you know, like Isaac said, they know that something's wrong, but they might not know how to get to the solution, or they might not know that something is illegal. It's just happening to them and they accept it. And a lot of folks that receive, like for example, if you are getting an eviction notice, you're going into like fight or flight mode. Like you're trying to figure out what you're going to do to not end up under a bridge. So you, in a state of crisis, we don't have the capacity to think clearly, to figure out, okay, what are my options? Who's behind this? What can I do? Like most people are trying to figure out where they're gonna go live. And so investigative reporting has helped because reporters have the capacity to analyze things, to research, okay, who's the landlord? Are they doing things right under their business structure? Are they, you know what I mean? Investigative reporting has uncovered a lot of horrible things. And I think that is an answer, deep diving and investigative reporting on these issues and what are the solutions? What's this issue and what's the solution? Let's let's analyze those things in more of the things that we see in the media.
Good thing that's CJC's goal, to
Facts.
get to those solutions. What about anybody else? Is there anything else you guys? Yeah, go ahead.
I had a couple of quick questions
Yeah.
and then another one.
Go for it.
You've referred several times to the fact that Mecklenburg County's eviction rate is twice the national average. Why? Why is that?
Yeah, that statistic, you know, I was getting that statistic from Eviction Lab, and that might be an older number, so don't hold me. It might have slightly changed since then, but I mean, it's
above the national
average. It's above the national average, and there's other cities in North Carolina that are way above the national average too, like Greensboro and Durham, for example, are pretty much just as bad. I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that looking at a statewide basis, of course, like the evictions in the metropolitan area, there's more of them because there's more people that live here. But there's even some county, like rural counties, like Edgecombe County, that's out towards the eastern part of the state. It has like the highest out of all counties in the state, and that's not a metropolitan area, and the rents there are not as high as they are here. So I mean, there's I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, there's probably a lot of different factors that play into that. It could be the way our laws are set up, you know, the way that the proceedings work, like, you know, a lot of tenants not being able to show up for their first court hearing. It could be a mixture of that and the rents, you know, lower wages, no rent control. I mean, there's probably a whole lot of stuff with that. But I will say, from a statewide perspective, it's not just Mecklenburg County. There's other places, including some, you know, rural communities in North Carolina that have similar issues.
Do you all know what the racial makeup is of the people who are being evicted?
I can tell you, like, so legal aid, we represent, you have to make under a certain amount of money for us to represent you, because our mission is to represent people that really need our help but can't otherwise afford it. Mm-hmm. And I think this tracks with like what I've heard from Eviction Lab and Matthew Desmond and there's other authors that have written about this. And I can attest to this, like over 90% of my clients that come into Charlotte are black women, and most of them have children. And so that's the main demographic that gets hit the hardest. And a lot of other people have written about that and done studies about that. I think, you know, Matthew Desmond, when he wrote his book Evicted, that got a lot of traction and looked at a lot of stuff in other places across the country, you know, he made a comparison between the number of black men that are incarcerated in America and how disproportionate that is to the disproportionate amount of black women that are evicted in the United States. And I definitely think that they're the biggest group in Mecklenburg County because I see it every day. And his quote was, you know, in the United States, like we lock black men up and we lock black women out, was what he said. But you do see that. I mean, there's national studies on that, but you can go into a courtroom in Mecklenburg County in the morning and like 90% of the people there are people of color, and most of them are women.
And then that's not even to mention the data that we're missing. Most of the Latino community, if they get a letter, threatening letter, they're gonna
They're
go.
gone.
They're leaving. They're not waiting for court. They're not waiting for eviction. They don't want problems. And so we have a lot of the community that is, well, first, we don't have the language. Some don't have documentation, legal
Right.
status. And so those, think about disabled people, black folks, immigrants from other countries.
Yeah.
Those are the people that are suffering, always, in every aspect of everything.
Okay, and then the whole right to counsel movement, do you see us being able to get any traction on that in North Carolina?
I don't know, honestly, I mean, I'm not very politically savvy, and I'm not, legally, we're not allowed to be political or lobby anyway, so at the statewide level, I'm not really sure, but what we have seen is a lot of local governments stepping in to try to provide things like that, and I think the first significant step here was from the Mecklenburg County government, who a few years ago came in and said, you know, we're gonna quadruple your funding so that you get more money, so that you can hire more staff, and again, that's taken us from like 300 cases a year to last year was 1,700, but it's still a small portion of the whole. So it takes money and it takes funding. Some states have done it on a statewide level, but statewide in North Carolina have not heard anything. But a lot of local governments and communities are starting to pitch in and trying to build on that. Yeah.
One idea, I wonder if this has been done, the idea of peer counselors or something, could non-lawyers be trained to help their neighbors or?
Yeah, and actually,
If you did something like that, I mean,
Yeah.
you could, you know, get much bigger numbers.
yeah.
And make some more of a dent in all those folks who don't have any kind of counsel.
Yeah, so we do try to do a lot of public outreach and education. We do a lot of trainings online and across the city. We actually had a program with Crisis Assistance Ministry that was very successful, that kind of got thrown off during the pandemic because it was a program that happened at Crisis's office in the big waiting room where everybody would talk to each other.
Yeah.
That essentially where we would train non-attorney volunteers on what kind of information would be helpful for somebody that's being evicted and like point them towards the right resources in the community. And that ran for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, and it was really successful. And so there are models out there for things like that. It's been kind of hard, you know, we're still in a lot of ways rebuilding from everything that happened during the pandemic, but I do think that's important. I mean, public education is important, and you know, our hope is if we teach one person, they'll go tell 5 other people, and hopefully remember it the right way. So that kind of stuff too.
Right.
But that is an important piece because we do not have enough like public interest attorneys to represent everybody right now, and it would take a significant amount of money to make that happen. Yeah.
Looks like our time is about up, but is there any other last questions that we have? Yeah.
Yeah, are there examples of other states in which there have been organized efforts to address rent control? So, I mean, in North Carolina, clearly, at a state level, that's not possible. But are there other places in which, in some way, the people who represent the interests of tenants have gotten together to address that?
There has, and I can't rattle off a list off the top of my head, but it's not just New York that has rent control legislation. New York City, for whatever it is, on the forefront of a lot of like tenant protections and stuff like that. But I think that there are other examples across the country, some local and some at the state level. The kind of thing that's not unique to North Carolina, but it's very challenging in North Carolina is that not only is there nothing at the state level that allows that, but there's a state law that says that local governments cannot do that. So like that law would have to go away before any kind of local governments could do anything, as far as any kind of rent control ordinances or anything like that.
And not to be discouraging, right, but that's kind of discouraging that there's a lot of blocks for us to push things that we know are good for our community. But my job as a community organizer is to challenge all of us to not think of solutions to the problem in the way of programs. let's talk, because there were programs to provide rent assistance during the pandemic. And what happened, a lot of landlords did not accept those, that assistance. And so all of the programs yes, programs are great, but if we don't attack it at the root of the issue, the legislation, it's never going to get done. Things are never going to change. The next 20 years, we're going to be here again. We're going to be old people, and we're going to be talking about this. No offense, Diane. Seasoned. Seasoned. You know what I mean? So I want to challenge us to think of things in a way that we can systematically change them. Let's not create programs that will just help in the moment. We need it. I don't want to see tent city anymore. I want to see people in decent, beautiful housing. And I believe that people that live in their home should own their home.